Hi guys, welcome back. I'm going to demonstrate how to develop remotely, so how to connect Visual Studio Code to a remote server through Remote SSH. So as you can see, I've already set up my development server on DigitalOcean. It has an public IP address of 165.22.53.94. I already have SSH access to the server, so I've already generated my SSH key pair. So IDRSA pub is the file that I copied to my development server. So if we look at settings, SSH key, if you want to add extra SSH keys for different devices to access the remote server, then you just have to add it in the settings. And different cloud providers like AWS, Azure, GCP, Google Cloud Platform, they're going to have different methods of doing so. Now let's go back to our droplets and development server. I'm going to be using cmdir. Let's just prove that we can SSH into the development server. So I'm going to copy this public IP address, going to write down SSH root because that's the default user, and I'm going to paste the IP address. So if I press enter, and there you go. So I'm logged into the server. So ls, I've been working on a React project on this server. But what I'll do is I will possibly have a WordPress instance set up. I've already installed Docker and Docker Compose on this server. So I'll go through how to install that in another tutorial, but to demonstrate a running server, I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to run the commands to prove that it is installed. So Docker Compose version 1.292 and Docker, so Docker version 20.10.8. So what we want to do, right, is we want to get a WordPress instance, right? So WordPress Docker Compose quick start, right? Now, so to create a simple container, you can either run the command without Docker Compose file and you can pull the image directly, but then if you want to be able to easily configure the settings, then you would create a Docker Compose YAML file, and every time you change the settings from that YAML file, you would have to recreate the image to represent the changes in the container. Now, let me explain to you what a container is. A container is just like a virtual machine, which it creates another environment, but it's not exactly like a virtual machine, because a virtual machine is a separate operating system with a full separate virtualized environment, right? But Docker containers, you use your existing infrastructure of your current server and just it creates a couple of layers in between your host OS that you're running the container on, and it simulates the environment that you need in terms of a configuration. So instead of having to install Ubuntu from scratch, you can just say look for an Ubuntu image, or in this case it's WordPress, and it will create the container environment for WordPress, and it will be running on top of your actual server, right? So let me just to clarify that. So contain, right? So in this case, you've got your host operating system infrastructure, and then you've got your Docker, and then app A, B, C, D, E, F, but each app that you have within the containerized application can be running its own environment. So it could be app A could be in Ubuntu, app B can be in CentOS, and so on and so forth, right? And you can have say 2 Linux servers, one hosting your database and then one hosting your actual application, and it could be used for a lot of things. You can use it for, say, if you're using Kubernetes and you wanted to load balance, you could have the different container instances to help load balance your main app, which is in your main working container, right? So, okay. here's the difference, right? So with the virtual machine, you've got a physical operating system. So guest operating system working on top of, you know, the hypervisor, top of the infrastructure, right? So that just ends up using more resources, whereas containerized application, it just leverages the host operating system and you simulate the guest operating system, but it's just working primarily on top of the host operating system, right? Okay, so hopefully that explains what briefly it is. So what I'm just going to do is let me explain the configurations on this sample. So essentially, with this Docker compose YAML file, it will create 2 containers. So you've got services, and it creates a database, and it creates the WordPress, right? So the database is going to be on a different container, and the WordPress instance is going to be on a different container, and this WordPress container depends on this database, so it will be able to access it within its internal network, right? And here, in terms of volumes, is that volumes exposes so it mounts the internal working directory of, say, that container that you're using, right? So it's kind of like Samba, where it allows you to, you know, share a specific folder within a VM so you can be able to publicly access it. But in this case, you're using you know, mounting to mount the volume within the container to, you know, the outside container of the host's device. So it could be the server that's hosting the container. Here we've got WordPress data, and you've got the database data, and you've got, you know, default password, database user password, so root password and password. Usually you'd have this in some sort of, you know, secrets file so that you don't expose these credentials. And also the same thing with this environment. So let's try this. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll create a separate folder. So make dir and say WordPress sample, right? And let's go to WordPress sample. Right. Now what we want to do is, let me just make this full screen. So touch docker compose .yaml YML. Now we want to vim. So essentially I'm doing this through alt command line, but later on I'll show you how to access all of this using Visual Studio Code. And it works on the same principle as SSHing, but it allows you to use the text editor, the IDE Visual Studio Code to edit it. So it's not like where if you have a VM where you have to actually have the VM open and edit the code inside the VM. You can you know, edit the code remotely, so you don't have to worry about, you know, remoting into desktop, remoting into the server. You can, because when you desktop remote into the server, it could be very, very slow, because when you're accessing a server remotely, it has to stream the, you know, server over to your screen, and you know, there could be a lot of delays. Whereas if you access the files through SSH and then you have the IDE to represent the files, then it's so much more easier, right? And it's much more efficient use of resources, because you're just streaming the file changes, you're not streaming the actual, you know, the screen of your server, right? And this is another reason why when you are deploying to servers, it's basically console based and it's not the desktop version where you see the user interface, because it does slow down the server if the version of the OS was the one that was enabled with the user interface, right? Now, okay, so let's use Vim to edit this file, and then let's just go select I. Now let's just make sure that we copy this whole thing. So Control C, copy, and then Control paste. Okay. Yes, so see how, yeah, so in this case, basically when you copy and paste through command line, sometimes it doesn't do it optimally, and that's why you get this whole mess. So that's what you don't want to do. So actually I'll show you, so I guess I can show you how to remote into the server then. So first, you need to install, so let me close this first because I don't want you guys to cheat. Right. So first you go to the extensions, right? Then you have to install Remote SSH, right? So Remote SSH, I've already installed this, but you have to install Remote SSH, and also you have to install Remote SSH editing configuration files, right? So they go hand in hand. So once you install both of them, then you'll notice this green button or green icon on the bottom left, right? And it says open a remote window. So select that, and before we connect to the host, let me just show you something. So essentially, I said that you have to have a public-private pair key, SSH key, to be able to access the remote server, right? You can either have that, or you can either have it through a password-enabled server, but that's an old practice because passwords they're less safe than SSH keys. So how Remote SSH works and how that accesses the remote server, it essentially reads your SSH config files, right? So it reads this file over here, config. In the config, you have to reference your key, the identity file, which is your IDRSA key pair, right? So that when it is trying to connect via SSH, it references that config file, and it authenticates, itself when it's trying to. So it authenticates itself when it tries to connect to the remote server, right? So let's just see what I have there for now. So I'm just going to use Notepad++. I've already have, these configs are basically for my local VMs that I've set up with my virtual machine. But in this case, I've already set up this development server. So that's the IP address that we had for DigitalOcean. And when you create the config, you have to create an alias, right? So host and then the alias. So this is the alias that you would use to access that remote server. And by default, it has root. So if you want to use this configuration to access a different user, then you would just change this root into the user the other user on that server. And then the identity file is the file location. So in this case, it's user, my name, and .ssh IDRSA, right? Okay, so you could also see that in Visual Studio. So let's go back, and if I press that green icon again, and I can open SSH config. In this case, yeah, so I can open it up here and edit it here, which if you're going to use this Visual Studio Code to edit your code anyway, then you should pretty much change the settings here, right? Okay, so now we've got that. So now we can connect, right? So connect to host, and then this case, see, you can see React.js, HTML, CSS, and then development server. So we want to connect to the development server. Now that's opening another window, right? So let's open that up, and at the very beginning, it will take some time to connect. So at the moment, now it's connected, but initially, let's show you first. Say if you type in LA, that will show you the hidden folders, and see how here it says VS Code server. So before you use Remote SSH, that VS Code server folder is not going to be there, but it copies when you set that up for the first time. VSCode is going to copy that onto the server, and that's the configuration for that on Remote SSH, right? So, okay, so now SSH development server, that's set up. Now you go open folder. So that, essentially this is the root directory of the remote server. And what we want to do is go to WordPress sample, because that was the folder that we created to show the WordPress site. Okay, so press OK. Now, yeah, so at the moment, so see how we created the Docker Compose YAML, and before we tried to copy. So this is basically the use case of why you would use Remote SSH, because before we tried to copy the settings through command line, right? So at the moment that's an empty file, but yeah, before we tried to copy the settings through command line, but everything was, you know, garbage, right? Like it made a mess. So, but now what we can do is, because since we're using the IDE to edit remotely, we can easily just, you know, Control-C, copy, and then Control-V, paste. So yeah, so save that. And also what you can do as well is, that's not the only thing you can do with Visual Studio Code, but you can also create, say, a new terminal, probably create another terminal, because, so what I usually do is I have two terminals. One terminal is to run the server, because the thing is, once you start running a Docker container or an actual server, right, you have to exit out of that and quit the, you know, stop the server if you want to run other commands, right? So if you want to keep the server running so that you can do developments while the server is live and you can see, you know, the updates live, right? So if you want to keep the server running, but you also want to do command lines on the side, then you would probably open another command line, like split screen in, say, cmdir. You can, in cmdir, you can, you know, create with that plus sign on the bottom right, so you can create another console, and that's probably what you would do with cmdir. You would create two consoles, right? One running the code, and sorry, one executing and running the server, and then the other one you can just run other commands, right? So now I'll just demonstrate to you how you would execute this. So now we have a sample WordPress, and what we're going to do, right? So it's ports 8000, right? So 8080, right? We want to expose this to the outside world. So what we want to do is do that instead. So 0.0.0.0.8000:80. So that port forwards the port 80 inside the container to the port 8000 of the remote server, right? So that way, if you write in the public IP address of your remote server and the port in the browser, you can access the website, the WordPress website, from that container. Okay, so let's go. But first we need to create this container. So what we would do is we would run Docker Compose up, right? Okay. Maybe let's do it through here. So sometimes it freezes, but I'm going to show you through here first. So just making sure that all my containers are deleted, because if this was a actual server with multiple containers, then you don't want to do this. You don't want to run Docker container prune, because it might delete certain containers that you actually need. But this is just to make sure that there's no hanging containers. So at the moment there shouldn't be. So yeah, there's none. So let's do it here. Docker Compose up. run docker compose up detached. Okay. So now what it's doing is it's pulling the MySQL container, and it's also pulling the WordPress container as well. So while that's happening, right, let's look at what's actually happening in the background in terms of, it hasn't done it yet, but okay, so have a look at this. There's WordPress, so it's running, and so sorry, the database is running and WordPress is running, right? Now what I find interesting, right, so what we should have done, so I'm trying to find where this folders are located, so I think so just to show that you can actually access the WordPress site, so the public IP address you copy, and because we port forwarded 8000, right, you should be able to access WordPress site here. So see, now it's asking for the installation. Now I've made a mistake, because when mounting these volumes, I should have done this. So that means in the current working directory, it's going to mount that current folder that's there. So in this case, we don't have that folder in the location, right? But when you recreate the container, then it's going to recreate that folder, right? So let me just do it again. So see, we have docker compose. When you go docker compose ps, right, that shows it running. So to stop containers, you just go, yeah, so docker compose stop. Then docker compose ps, right? Then it's exited, docker compose down. This will, delete the container, right? So the reason why we're removing it, because we want to recreate it, because we just made sure that these files will be generated within the current folder, right? So let's just clear this and docker compose up. See, now, yeah, so as you can see, it's still running, but this is when you run docker compose up without the detach. So it's going to show you, what is happening in the background of that container until you press Control-C, which will quit the server. And then if you want it to be running again, you'd have to go docker compose start again. So you would have to start again. But if you want it to do that from the get-go and you don't want it to be stuck here, you can go docker compose up -d, which is detach, so that you don't have to stay in that, in the containers console, right? Okay, so you've got your folders here, and let's demonstrate it that it's running. So, okay, it's running. Okay, so we've got the defaults, and essentially if you know how to set up WordPress, we could easily just go continue and set up the credentials. But the main point of this this tutorial is to demonstrate how to edit files remotely. So because you've mounted, the volumes, right? So you've got WordPress data and you've got database data. So here, this is the files of, the MySQL container, right? Which you probably won't be touching as much, but here you've got the WordPress folders, got the content, and then you've got, themes. So say 2020 theme. You've got, now with WordPress, you would be editing, so you'd be usually, a lot of the times, if you're not making custom theme, then you'd be editing the code within WordPress itself. So you would either have a theme editor just like Elementor, which simplifies the process of editing. But in this case, if you're going to do custom code, then you can do it from here as well. Okay, so that's about it. That's how you access server remotely and how to edit files from remotely and being able to access it on your local device. If you like this video, put a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to watch more videos like this. I'm going to be posting videos about, tutorials on coding and software development, and also potentially, interviews with clients and reviews and marketing material, as BetterByte is an agency that we do software development for clients, and we also do a bit of marketing, and we also do, electronics development and cloud and IoT, systems development for clients. So there's going to be a lot of things that is going to go up on this channel. But yeah, put a thumbs up and subscribe for the algorithm so that we can expose more of what we're doing to our intended audience and more people can find us. If you do so, that would be greatly helpful. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.